Okay, so now we want to take this value and create a new list item out of it. So let's just hop back into our index.html for a moment so we understand exactly where our list items are going. So there's a big fat clue there, which is my comment within the unordered list. So this is where our dynamically generated list items are going to actually live. So as you can probably have guessed, our next selector in this case is going to be the unordered list. This is the element we want to target and basically insert our new list items into it. So let's go ahead and make our next selector out of this ID here. Returning to our JavaScript file, we're going to use this ID as our next selector. And now, how are we actually going to insert our list item into it? Well, if we return back to the documentation, let's go ahead and see if we can find something useful for us. Just to preface this, going back a little bit to project 2, when I was explaining the DOM and we inspected our DOM visualization for our accordion project and our index.html file, the two were nearly identical. There was nothing that differed in the DOM than in our HTML file. And I told you I would mention the point we reach where this is not the case. And that's where we are. So we're going to be generating these list items dynamically. We're not going to be hard coding them into our HTML file. The JavaScript is going to be creating them for us. And this is known as DOM manipulation. So we are manipulating the DOM. We are either adding or removing elements to it. And you may hear jQuery referred to as a DOM manipulation library because this is one of its most useful functions. This is something that's tremendously hard to do in JavaScript. It takes many more lines of code, and jQuery has simplified it. So if we scroll down, left-hand side here, we can see a large section on manipulation. So manipulation, like I said, is one of the most useful features of jQuery. And there is actually broken down into applicable sections here. So in this case, we know we want to insert our list items inside our unordered list. So let's go ahead into the DOM insertion inside. So our first available method to us in this case is what we're actually going to use. It's called append. It's very common, and we're actually just going to insert our new HTML into our targeted element. So just looking at the example briefly, you can see that in this case, there's two divs with the class of inner. And when we append a new HTML element, in this case, you have to pass in a string, that this p tag with the text of test gets inserted into both elements with the ID of inner. So applying this to our project, let's go back into our code. And what we're actually going to do is append a list item. So I've made an empty list item for now, because how are we going to get this variable that we created with the ID of item, or with the name of item, into our list item? Well, that's going to be done through what's called concatenation. Concatenation is something that almost all programming languages offer, but what it actually means is just that it's adding multiple strings, and the result of concatenation is a new string. So in this case, we're going to break these list items up into two different strings, and then in the middle, we're actually just going to use a plus sign to add our variable. So our variable is named item, and we are going to go ahead and add it to the string before and the string behind it. So the result of this is going to be a new string that is a list item with the item name in the actual inner text of that HTML element. So let's go ahead and give this a spin. If we go and save this, open up our page in the browser, and does this work? Awesome. So we've got our first to-do list item added here. As you can see, we've got a little bit more work to do to get it looking like the final example, but now we're actually appending our first DOM element. Okay, so we've got a couple things left to do in order to get our code here looking like the example of the final project I showed you in the beginning. So Remember the feature where you could actually check the checkbox at left and it's going to go ahead and strike through the item? Well, that's going to be what we tackle next, but we actually need to create that text box when we create the list item. So let's go within this list item here and actually add an input. This input's going to have a type of checkbox. And let's go ahead and close that there. So now we're creating our checkbox in the beginning of our list item. And then there was also that X to the far right. When you clicked on, it's going to actually remove the DOM element. So that's what we'll be tackling after we do the strike through. And let's go ahead and add our X here. So we can make an A tag just with the letter X in it. Close that out. And because I know we're eventually going to be targeting this and using it to remove our DOM element, let's go ahead and just give this a class of remove. Awesome. So let's go ahead and examine this now in the browser. Awesome. So now we've got our checkbox here, and we actually have our X, which we will eventually target this to strike through our item and target this in order to remove our DOM element. One last minor detail, going back to our page or our code for a moment, I'm just going to add an actual HR tag here. An HR tag is just basically used to show a separation of content. So going back to our to-do list here, refreshing the page, we added our HR now. And so that's going to be this line here that separates our new content. So got that styled. Now let's go ahead and work on actually clearing the value out of this input field here. So now we have our value. We're utilizing that value to create a new list item. And now we need to clear out that value. So when we were using the submit function earlier before we prevented its default behavior, it was clearing that out for us. So we need to build that back in. So in this case, all we're going to do is actually use our value method that we used earlier. We can actually go ahead and just copy and paste this line of code here. So what we're going to actually do, instead of retrieving the value that the user put in, we're actually going to reset the value. And in this case, we're going to reset it to nothing. It's just going to be an empty string. So let's go give that a shot. Clear values. Clear values. Awesome. So our list item's being added, and now our input field again is clear for our next item to be added.